So, Donald Trump's tariffs have set the economic world aflame. All of the Wall Street titans that piled in behind him and paid for him to become president again are feeling terribly betrayed because he's done what he said he always wanted to do for the entirety of his political career. There's a ton of commentary out there that will describe to you why this is economically insane. There is a ton of commentary out there talking about what is happening to the stock market, which is appalling. I can testify to that. Talking about the real long-term danger that this might place U.S. dominance, dollar dominance, the ability of the U.S. to call economic shots. This might be in real danger because of this. I think that's all true. Today, the stock market looks a little bit better, but that's just day by day. Tomorrow, the plunge could continue. Perhaps, people run away from the dollar or the treasuries or this, that, and the other thing. All of that is very possible. But I don't have any particular added expertise that I can add to that. So actually what I want to do today is jump back into Thucydides. Most of what I'm presenting today is a podcast that I recorded weeks ago. It was more talking about Trump's threats to Greenland and Panama and this, that, and the other thing. But it also applies really directly to this tariff thing. I think the chances of Donald Trump triggering a truly massive worldwide economic catastrophe are higher than they've ever been, but that does not mean that I think they are high. I think this could be, like Brexit, more of a slow burn where more and more countries realize that in their long-term planning, they have to plan without the United States, and that impacts the United States negatively on the scale of years or decades. I think that's very likely. But I also think there's a distinct chance that Donald Trump could just get away with this. Donald Trump is constructing a more directly, openly thuggish world, but he is using the toolbox and the weapons that were given to him over the course of decades. Certainly in the 21st century, for the entirety of my adult life, the past 25 years or so, every U.S. president has been trending further in this direction, basically turning a coalition into an empire, turning allies into subjects. And this guy, Thucydides, who's been somewhat abused in Washington, D.C. commentary, has a lot to say about exactly this dynamic. The United States, in a lot of ways, is Athens and is doing exactly what Athens did to eventually lose out big. So that's the subject of this podcast. We talk about tariffs a little bit in it, but I think that the dynamic that we talk about in this podcast is really the best intervention that I could make into the discussion around these tariffs. It talks about what this means for U.S. power and how, as crazy and thuggish and gross as Donald Trump is, he's not really deviating from the trajectory of U.S. presidents and U.S. foreign policy over the past quarter century. He's just doing it harder.
The people that Trump has been the worst to have been the coalition of allies that helped us win the Cold War. This is what this book is about. It's about Athens becoming monstrous to the allies that helped them beat the Persians.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Marie, in charge of podcasting, and with me as always, in charge of politics, is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
I'm pretty good. No real complaints. How you doing, Ray?
I'm doing well. A bit of frost today and a busy day at work, but apart from that, it's good to get back into podcasting.
Spring is beginning to spring in New York City. So, going outside without 15 layers, contemplating bike rides again. It's all very nice.
Is there anything you want to talk about today? Any power struggles? Anything Trump's up to? Anything crazy?
Well, actually, so Trump has, strangely enough, got me thinking about ancient Greece.
Oh.
And this concept...
Because he's always talking about the classics. He's a very well-educated man, isn't he?
That's true. His tendency to end dinners with an ancient Greek ode is famous.
Mm-hmm.
Man loves his Homer.
Yeah.
Jokes aside, there is the concept of Thucydides and the Thucydides trap that has been bandied about quite successfully, sort of rebranded over the past decade to refer to a certain dynamic in U.S.-Chinese relations. And I think it's kind of nuts. And frankly, barely literate is sort of the Washington, D.C. interpretation of the Thucydides trap. What I argue for is something called the real Thucydides trap.
Oh.
And this is something that I think Donald Trump has really it's a trap that he has sprung on the rest of the world. Now, that's, of course, it's not just a Trump thing.
Is this a classic America thing where America can set all these traps that everyone else has to fall into and America can just wander off and do something else?
Pretty much, but this is a much longer term trap
Oh.
than Mr. Donald Trump himself. I think he's illustrating it in a new way. He's making it more present. So I thought it would be a good time to revisit the Thucydides trap, the book by Thucydides that everybody talks about, the history of the Peloponnesian War,
Mhm.
and sort of talk about why this book is still important, why I wish people would actually read it instead of take one sentence and say stupid things about the United States and China, why it
Mhm.
really timely warnings for the United States during the Trump administration, most egregiously, but also during the Biden administration and the Obama administration and the Trump administration. We are doing exactly what happened in this book. Perhaps that exaggerates it a bit, but we are definitely exhibiting the kinds of behaviors that a city-state called Athens illustrated and caused extraordinary ruin to Athens and the entire Greek world. And we're doing that, except instead of doing that on the scale of a small sea between Anatolia and the Balkan Peninsula, we are doing it on the scale of the entire world.
Okay. What was I going to say is this is a very new theory, isn't it? It's only like 10 years old or something. It feels like giving it this ancient Greek name makes it sound like, oh, it's been around since the ancients, when it's pretty much just, we want a war with China.
Well, so the key thing about this book is that it's interesting to say it has never been out of print or what have you, like probably since print.
Yeah.
Probably there was some Venetian guy who first put it into print in like the 1500s, and people have always been reading this book. So what happened about 10 years ago is a very sort of internet post-literate savvy approach to branding this book. So like
Ah.
reading this book and knowing about this book has been just part of like the toolbox of knowing about government and politics for like all of modern history.
Okay.
What this was in the Wikipedia page, so don't,
Okay.
and I'm not going to vouch for it, but apparently Woodrow Wilson, when he took a boat across the Atlantic to settle World War I at the Versailles Peace Conference, apparently he was reading Thucydides on the boat over. So that just should give you like some indication of the long-term relevance of this book. And then recently, sort of semi-literate joke fake organizations like The Atlantic, a magazine in the United States, and Harvard University, like kind of this joke military industrial complex laugh college, turned it into this Thucydides trap garbage.
Okay. Because when I think of like a military college, you're imagining like a lot of the engineering of war and stuff like that. And then is there kind of like a weird like pseudo political thing they like to do to try to steer influence? Or what way is that university working?
Well, Harvard University is I like to make fun of it because
Okay.
it pisses me off, is a historied place of learning with incredibly intelligent people doing incredibly important things. However, it also has significant programs that are dedicated to cooking up BS that is useful to the Pentagon. So there is this thing called the Belfer Center at Harvard, and specifically a professor named Graham T. Allison, who my understanding is very well regarded and did important work during the Cold War. I haven't dived into that, but that's his reputation. He is now in his 80s or perhaps 90s, and around 2014, 2015, some people got together and were like, we desperately need to convince the American public that there's a real reason to start a war with China. And the Thucydides trap is one part of this. So what the whole Thucydides trap project is based around a single sentence in the very beginning.
So how many words would this book be? Because I know this is before the concept of books and stories and stuff really existed, but this is a proper big book. It's not like a lot of history books of the era that are quite thin.
Well, that's a very interesting thing to point out. So, book meant a different thing back then. This was when Thucydides wrote this back in the 400s BC. Oh, sorry, we say BCE now.
Hmm.
So, like 2,500 years ago, it would have been on scrolls.
Yeah.
And a book was basically at that point was how much you could put on a single scroll. So, supposedly after Thucydides had died, and he famously did not finish. The Peloponnesian War goes from 431 to 404, and it was written after, or a lot of it was written after the war. But he died while he only got as far as
But it's
411.
it's from
Mhm.
things he'd actually written. It's not like a lot of these ones where it's like 100 years after from oral accounts.
Well, that's the incredible thing about Thucydides, or Thucydides, as the
Hmm.
Greeks perhaps might have called him, and we are being encouraged to refer to him now more. The actual historical Thucydides was a general in this war.
Okay. So he knew his stuff.
He knew his stuff. He had a viewpoint, and everyone who reads this, including I think Thucydides himself, points out that he has a bias. He has an axe to grind. What's kind of interesting is what people suggest is he was an Athenian general who was involved in a failed effort in this war and was then, I think, exiled from Athens. So it's not, I mean, he actually has some resentments against Athens, and that's one of the more interesting things about the story he tells here. But anyway, sorry to you, what I think was your actual question. In current English translation, Thucydides' history is 620 pages long. The basis of the Thucydides trap comes in at like page 10. It is one sentence, the real reason for the war was this. What made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta.
Oh no.
So this is
Rising powers.
yes, this is exactly it. The rising power like idea that I think has I think probably predated the Thucydides trap concept, but was really given huge force by the Thucydides trap. This is why Harvard and the Belfer Center, which is absolutely, the Defense Department's carve out on the Harvard campus, were so concerned to successfully push this idea that Sparta is the United States, the
Hmm.
old established power, and China is Athens, the rising power. And if you guys are interested, I've got plenty of videos going back a decade talking about how silly this whole project is.
But
Um,
everybody wants to be Sparta.
yeah, and it's just not. It's not what this book says. To put it much more simplistically than it should be. If you actually read the book instead of a sentence or two, it's
Hmm.
really clear that the analog for Athens is the United States. And this is a book fundamentally about empire. This is a book about what happens when a newly powerful country, the United States, circa the 1940s, or the beginning of the 20th century, finds itself in a position where they can put together a coalition, as the United States found itself in during the Cold War. And what happens when that coalition curdles away into empire, and the power at the center of it now that's the real Thucydides trap, and that is what Thucydides is actually warning about, and the warning that he's providing. Now, that's of course not the only thing Thucydides is doing here. He did not necessarily think that a situation like Athens would rise again, but you can't read this book, Rory, without it shouting at you on every other page how it is, Athens and the United States are the same thing, and the United States is doing exactly what Athens did, that tore the classical Greek world to shreds, and brought blood, failure, and destruction to Athens and to everybody else. And that's the Thucydides trap that we're seeing
If
here.
America is Athens,
Mhm.
then is China Sparta, or is Sparta a completely different entity?
The rest of the world is like, it's not. This isn't really a book about Sparta. Is sort of the thing. Certainly, there are Spartan generals, there are Spartans that do things, but this is a book about Athens and about the hubris of Athens, about Athens deciding to bite off more than it can chew,
Hmm.
losing track of its basic principles, and becoming the great threat that they were organized to fight, and becoming worse than the Persians that had created the coalition of Greeks that became the Athenian
Hmm.
Empire. And it's such an obvious this is a book about Athens, like, and what Athens did to itself. And it's amazing that it's now become a watchword for, oh, the U.S. should be more aggressive and should figure out. It's exactly the opposite. The real Thucydides trap is turning a coalition of alliances into an empire with one center, and everybody who's in that coalition that has become an empire becomes bullied subjects. And I think the obvious reasons why that makes sense from the Trump perspective. I think that's it's pretty obvious. Trump's brutalization, at least, mostly just in words at this point, but brutalization of Europe, Ukraine, Mexico, Canada. These are places that are very firm U.S. allies, very much a part of the
Seems to be
U.S.
all allies except Israel.
Well, yes, yeah, that's sort of how we do things. So all of this, like this whole, the people that Trump has been the worst to have been the coalition of allies that helped us win the Cold War, and this is what this book is about. It's about Athens becoming monstrous to the allies that helped them beat the Persians. So, and I mean, it's long before the Thucydides trap concept was formulated. This was I mean, if you got into international relations, if you studied, I think, the whole topic of international relations, this is where you started with this 2,500-year-old book.
What would it have taught people about international relations before this Thucydides, sorry my pronunciation, trap theory came about?
Well, it's a narrative about a war. It is a very detailed narrative about a war. There are passages of this that are like iconic in Western civilization. This ranks with, the some of the greatest literature we have. And what makes classical literature so important, Rory, isn't that necessarily the qualities of the work, though I would, having read this a couple times, I think there is real quality of this work that's worthwhile. It's that for 500 years, everybody has thought this was worthwhile. I've been thinking a lot, actually, this morning. It's like, how did this particular work stand the test of time? I mean, these words were written 2,500 years ago, obviously not in English. And there is so much. I think they have, I might be getting this exact figure wrong, but I think they have a bibliography of what was at, like, the Library of Alexandria, or perhaps it was some other rich person's library or something like that. And they estimate that of the great works that were worth going through I mean, this wasn't like today where, anybody can do a Twilight fan fiction and print up 50 copies for their friends. Like, to have a book in a library before the printing press, before the 1450s.
Oh yeah, it was incredibly difficult.
Incredibly laborious. So, like, we have these inventories of these libraries, and they have lists of the books that were there, and we know about these books that were in these libraries 2,000 years ago. So the incredible effort. And they estimate that like 95% of all of that stuff that was worthy enough is just gone, like completely
Gone
lost.
to history.
There's no way. And there's a lot of stuff. I mean, there's whole books written about, how certain epic pieces of poetry were, I think Ovid's Metamorphoses were like fortuitously discovered in a monastery somewhere. This, I don't think, was ever like had to be discovered.
It was just always there.
It was just always there because it is transparently useful to everyone who wants to exercise power. Like, this is a story that what happened to a lot of the ancient literature, Rory, is it was pagan. It was talking about the founders of Christianity were just epic prudes. They they did not want to talk about a whole range of topics. You mentioned gods or goddesses, you're getting burned. You mentioned any kind of sexual stuff, you're getting burned. You mentioned, really there's only certain very useful things that survive the Middle Ages, like medical texts, or this, which is for
Generals?
2,500 years been, for generals or for people who want to think about politics or whatnot. So it wasn't so significant in Western Europe, apparently, until like the 1400s or 1500s. I got so interested in this morning that I ordered another book on the topic.
Wow.
But
is it a bit like how a lot of ancient Greek knowledge sort of went through Persia and then went into India and then came back that way? Was it more popular in India and places like that?
So I think that happened with a lot of classical literature. Essentially, the Arabs specifically, and going into as you said, into Persia or sort of Central Asia, saved a lot of Greek texts that were allowed to come back. But this was so useful for rulers and was just such a key part of Greek history, and even the Byzantines, the rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire that lasted into the 1400s. Even though they certainly saw themselves as Roman, they did consider what happened to classical Athens as part of their
History.
heritage. Yeah, their heritage. So this didn't have to go into an Arab library to survive. It survived in the libraries of the Eastern Roman Empire. And apparently, as with a lot of other things, sort of the launching of the Renaissance in Europe, a lot of it was the scholars who were forced out of Constantinople when it fell finally in 1453. So a Greek monk showed up in Italy in the 1400s with
Mhm.
a number of manuscripts of this, and that's apparently where almost all of our interpretations of what this book actually is come from.
Okay. Have any other ones come up since? Any other interpretations been found, say in India or elsewhere?
I I saw something about they had found fragments that were interesting, but it
Hmm.
does appear, and of course, like that, is every word exactly the word that Thucydides put down? Of course not. But it is much more of this has survived in a much larger form than all the vast majority of classical
Is it
literature.
written in modern English or is it still a bit like old fashioned, a bit like the Bible?
Well, it depends on the translation. I think there's more
Hmm.
modern translations. I don't know, the one that I'm working on was from it's from 1954.
Hmm.
So, and I found it perfectly fine. Because yeah, they'll redo a I don't know what the most recent translation of Thucydides is, but they redo these every half century or so. Somebody gets down. I mean, didn't was it Seamus Heaney? He's a famous Irish poet, Beowulf. So that I mean, it's obviously a different section of ancient literature, but yeah, I mean that'll periodically happen with this as well. I found this 1950s version like pretty easy to read, but I mean for broadly, like if you pay attention not just to snotty, overly educated Western culture, but I mean the this is the world of 300.
Mm.
This is about 80 years later than the world of 300. That film, I guess it's old enough now that you have with Gerard Butler and
Yeah,
and
2007, I think it was.
yeah, Gerard Butler and Michael Fassbender, running around
Zack
in
Snyder.
loincloths, killing each other. Yes, that was Zack Snyder's first big film.
Hmm.
And I think probably most people are still vaguely aware of that. This is the world of classical Greece. This is the world where essentially it's different since the 60s and 70s, but if any government
Mm.
building in the United States or Europe.
Neoclassical.
Yes, exactly. Built
Hmm.
between 1750 and really, honestly, the 1500s and the 1970s was built to look like it came from this
Hmm. Like
time.
Stormont
This,
looks very neoclassical.
I don't know Stormont. What's the? Hmm.
The Northern Ireland government.
Yeah. If it's Stormont, was that built recently, or it
Oh
was
no,
an
it was
old?
built maybe in the 20s.
So it was an
Yeah, yeah,
an
yeah.
older building. It was repurposed. Really, like so much is inspired by this era, and what makes this so important, and I think contributed to its survival, is this is kind of the reason why we went in 150 years. We went in the 490s, the 480s, the magical time of Herodotus and the war of the Greeks against the Persians. The Persians come in 300. You have this absurd like
Oh
eight
yeah,
foot
yeah.
tall, like Brazilian dude. It's this monstrous other, which is not,
Well, I
obviously
think
not
it's seen as
historically.
it's that is told through a story. So obviously he's exaggerating the story to get everyone on board to fight
Yes.
these Persians.
Yes. But but that sort of kind of biased story goes back to Herodotus, who is seen as the father of history, and then Thucydides is sort of number two. And it's this idea that of Greek freedom against the Persians, which was so important throughout the 1,000 or 2,000 years of Roman history. So that's this magical time in the 480s or 490s. And then by the 330s, Alexander the Great's father of Macedon pretty much permanently extinguishes Greek freedom. And like the golden era of the city-states that gave us our architecture, that gave us our ideas of drama, that gave us our, first attempts at real medical knowledge that we've, built up from just this extraordinarily important period of like 150 years, philosophy, Socrates, Plato. Socrates and Plato were alive during this Peloponnesian War. Why in 150 years did we get from this glorious flourishing to just the end? And I think the Peloponnesian War, sorry, the Peloponnese confusingly is, I think it is the peninsula at the end of the Greek peninsula or something like that. But it's about the war between Sparta and Athens, who were the two most powerful elements fighting off the Persians. And it sort of explains why this incredible flourishing, fell into slavery again after just 150 years. So that's sort of like the historical reason why this has always been very important. So it's a war between the 430s and 404. There's a gap between the start of this, war between Athens and Sparta. There were smaller conflicts before, but this was a 3-decade conflict that defined the lives of everyone living in that, pocket of the Mediterranean. 490s, 480s. During that period, Athens formed a coalition. And just like the United States, after that coalition had been largely victorious, they scrambled around for reasons to keep going. The Persians had been kicked out of Greece. The Ionians had been largely freed. These were the Greeks sort of on the other side of the Aegean, I believe. But the Athenians said, no, we got to keep it together because the Persians could always come back. Over this period between, say, 480 and 430, the Athenian alliance, just a 50-year period, the Athenian alliance sort of calcified into an empire. Contributions of ships and money and men that used to be voluntary became tribute. And it's interesting, and I think this is also something that is useful parallel. The Spartans are famously really gross. Like their whole system is like, it's a little glorified even in the cinematic representation that film 300. But even there, it's like, yeah, this is kind of cool, but it's also like terrifyingly bleak. It's like children aren't allowed to stay with their families. They have to live in these camps and everybody's all about like Sparta is a totalitarian, like terrifying model. And that's something that people who think about politics have reckoned with throughout.
But I think also
sort of-
we don't have any records from Sparta itself. So quite often we're hearing other people's interpretation of it. So maybe they're embellishing it and it wasn't as warrior-like as we've been taught to believe.
I think that's entirely possible. But I do think there's some truth to the representation of Sparta as this heavily militaristic society. Did not have any, and this is part of the self-justification of Athens, in this 2,500-year-old document. It is the idea that Athens has democracy. Athens has a better way of running things, which is to be opposed to the Spartan kings and dominance and despotism. And I think it is fairly well documented that like the whole Spartan military life was based on the fact that they had a massive slave culture, that there was a whole nother population next to Sparta that they had enslaved that did all their work for them so they could live in their fun thong-wearing military groups or what have you. So, but what's interesting about that and why I'm bringing all this up is that Sparta was, and this is played with quite explicitly. I mean, not played with. This is acknowledged in here that Sparta, despite being the despotism that it was, the authoritarian system that it was absolutely standing up for Greek freedom, because and this interpretation really extends things a lot, but nowhere near as much as like Harvard's Thucydides trap garbage. So I'll take some. Keep in mind I'm taking some liberties here. But it does seem like Sparta was sort of standing up for sovereignty. The idea that, every city-state should, of course, our city-state includes this city-state next to us that we've conquered and all those slaves, but so kind of Russia and Ukraine, actually. So like they were standing up for the idea that, every city-state should be able to run its own thing, whereas Athens was conglomerating things. So it is this interesting tension, which is absolutely a contradiction, but I think is also true that you can have really gross places that are actually kind of standing up for the freedom of everybody else only because they want to keep doing their gross stuff. I think that's still valuable. Like, the Spartans are still better than the Athenians here. There's a lot of really iconic stuff in this. There's the Pericles funeral oration, where he sort of justifies the democratic approach of Athens, and it's always pointed to. And it's not quite as illiterate as taking. Oh, I'm sorry. The one line about how Sparta is afraid of Athens, that is the basis of this whole Thucydides trap thing. My edition suggests that actually that might have been a later addition to the text,
Okay.
because there's nothing else in the text that that actually indicates that that's the thing. But why would that matter?
So do you think that's a scholar later, hundreds of years later, adding this bit, or?
Or it could have just been, it could have been hundreds of years later. It could have been at any point. I mean, our knowledge, our direct-ish knowledge of this text starts in the 1400s or the 1500s. There's I can't recall if it's Cambridge or Oxford, but there are 600-year-old manuscripts of this, and that's what we're going with. What happened to the text before that? Oh, I don't know. It's hard to say. But we know for sure that there were changes, and there's been some. Actually, the author of this text doesn't think it was a later edition, but it says
so. It is disputed, though.
It's disputed, and the author of this introduction says it's disputed, and I can see why, because there's nothing else in the text that indicates that makes sense. So I think there's a ton of, with this text, long before the illiterates at Harvard in 2014 and 2015, of picking and choosing stuff that you like. The funeral oration of Pericles is this ringing defense of Athens and how magical it is. But if you read the actual text, this is funeral oration for a bunch of Athenians who have died in this war that Athens caused. It's actually sort of a last-ditch attempt by a very powerful and important Athenian figure, Pericles, to sort of justify this horror that they've created for themselves. And then a few pages later, he dies in a plague. So it's actually, so it's sort of, and people, because this is such an important text and always, has been for, 4 centuries, people love to cherry pick stuff and be like, oh, look at this incredible, meaningful stuff. Whereas Thucydides, a guy who was exiled from Athens and is clearly documenting the destruction of Athens, might actually be intending the whole funeral oration of Pericles as like kind of an exercise in really dark irony, to sort of, or to point out these were the great principles of Athens that actually are defensible and worth defending, and here's how we crush them into the dust. Another great example of this is the Melian dialogue, probably the most famous passage from this. Are you familiar with the strong will do what they will and the weak must suffer what they must? That's the Melian dialogue.
Oh, okay.
And the extraordinary thing, like I think most, even at Harvard, very few people are stupid enough to do this, but online and in like sort of conservative journals, you will see people who will say, yeah, the right, the strong will do what they will and the weak must suffer what they must. Like, this is in the context of Athens deciding to genocide one of its allies that like refused to submit to them entirely. Like, the lesson of the Melian dialogue is not that the Athenians are the good guys here. And it's like this book is incredibly rich and filled with such like obvious lessons. And it's incredibly frustrating to see it be used as a justification for more American militarization, when the lesson that it is shouting from the rooftops is, no, don't do this, you morons. And there's so much. There was one, what was the one in particular that really grabbed me? There's this whole passage. It's not from Pericles' funeral oration, but it's the debate. It's one of the debates at Sparta, I think. Athenian advocates come in to say, sure, we've got an empire, but can you think how much worse anybody else's empire would be? which is just such a standard argument. Like, at least once a week, I get that in the YouTube comments. Well, if you think American empire is bad, wait till you hear Chinese empire. And it's just so much of that. Was one that really jumped out at me this morning. Or the Athenians at Pylos, they've won. And we've seen this, multiple times. We saw this in 2022. We saw this in 2003 and 2004. Essentially, the United States wins some absurdly large victory and absolutely refuses to take the win. This is Athens wins a big victory, and true wisdom is shown by those who make careful use of their advantages in the knowledge that things will change. I mean, maybe Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had read his Thucydides before he suggested. I mean, famously, Mark Milley of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party in 2022, two actors in U.S. government that you can't imagine being more different, both spoke up when Ukraine had won its victories in 2022 and said, now's the time to negotiate. We've won this big victory. Let's solidify it. Let's negotiate a peace. And both Mark Milley and the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party were shouted down as betrayers and cowards and this, that, and the other thing. And of course, in the fullness of time, we can see that they were absolutely right, and that was Ukraine's best chance. After the fall of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, Iran approached the Bush administration with a incredibly sweeping deal that essentially gave the United States everything it could have possibly wanted out of Iran, and we didn't do it. We didn't do anything about it. And I think the passage of time and the effect of the passage of time is what people are missing when they pick and choose out of this book, because it's again, he died before he could finish it. But this covers 20 years in sometimes, I'll admit, a little mind-numbing detail, but covers 20 years of decay and destruction of the Athenian political model, the world that the Athenians control, and then that sort of falls apart around them. And it's that sense of time. And also there's a like sort of 15-page introduction that covers the whole period of time between the Greek Persian wars and sort of the building and consolidation of Athenian empire. And it's like when you have that full sweep of time and you can see the way that things fall apart, you learn so much more than you learn from sort of picking and choosing anecdotes. And when I look at the sort of the trajectory, I mean, I don't want to say culminating, but culminating so far in Donald Trump, the whole trajectory of the United States since its victory in the Cold War in the early 1990s is just Athens during that same time period. And it's just, I see nothing that indicates that it's not just going to get worse.
What ancient Greek city-states do you think America should take influence from?
Well, I mean, it's a very hard, there's a lot that's very cool about Athens. There's a lot that's very cool about Sparta. And sadly, despite efforts a while ago, those are the only two that I can really speak to at this point. And that's actually a really good point, right? It is, what really went on is so much more complicated than just Athens versus Sparta. Like Corinth was a big deal. I think after Athens and Sparta, I think Thebes was a huge, huge deal, perhaps more powerful than either of them had been. The problem was that Thebes was, the big fish when King Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great were taking over Greece before they took over the world. And I think Thebes might have sort of submitted and then not, and then unsubmitted. And then I can't remember whether it was Philip or Alexander, but they completely wiped out Thebes to the point where like no stone was standing on another one. Like just sold them all into slavery, slaughtered everybody, completely wiped out Thebes. So yeah, it's Athens and Sparta have really lucked out twice, actually, because they were, I believe, authentically kind of the main players in the fight against Persia in the 480s, and then their sweeping war against each other managed to get two great historians, Thucydides and Herodotus, that made them sort of the centerpiece of things. In Thucydides' book, you get a sense of the breadth of other Greek city-states that there were, literally hundreds. And the names come up, and I mean, most famously, the Melians, who all got wiped out. Yeah, I can't really speak. I haven't made it for essentially, Rory. I haven't made enough of a study of
Okay. No,
Greek
no, no.
city-states to come up with a better answer to that.
But is this a common tactic to, if you have a half-baked idea, is to just sort of glop it onto the classics to make it sound like, oh, this has been around for centuries, when really it's like, we just came up with this last week?
That's a great. I mean, yes. I can't think of an example that has been this successful. Like, I can't think of a recent example. That's a great question. But certainly, using the classics as cover for stuff you wanted to do and I mean, it goes back to, that's a practice that goes back to Roman times. One of the fascinating aspects is that the Roman Empire, the most famous parts of the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Mark Antony, the stuff they made the HBO TV show about anyway, like maybe geez, 20 years back at this point. Great TV show. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's fun to watch, and it makes you better versed in a lot of this stuff that every U.S. president up until Harry Truman, knew back and forth. And maybe that's unfair to Harry Truman. Maybe he knew it as well. It's a great TV show, but yeah, that sort of Cicero, Mark Antony, all that stuff was 400 years after the Thucydides book. And the Roman Empire that had, pretty vital life for 400 years after Julius Caesar, Cicero, that era, loved to use examples from the classical world. There's a book, I think it's Plutarch. It's irritating. There's Plutarch, who is the Greek or Roman historian in the 200s, and then there's Petrarch, I think,
Oh,
who was a poet in the 1200s. It's really frustrating in Italy, but I think Plutarch is the one who wrote the Lives, which is basically just juxtaposing famous Romans and famous Greeks, which is at that time would have been seen as like really kind of cheeky and a bit of effrontery. So actually, there's a part of me that is a little bit grateful to Harvard for just putting Thucydides in like
popular lexicon.
Yeah, this is a podcast talking about Thucydides. If we had done a hour-long podcast talking about Thucydides and his history of the Peloponnesian War before Harvard and the Atlantic and Graham T. Allison came up with this Thucydides trap thing, nobody would listen to it. But I anticipate putting Trump and Thucydides in the title of a podcast will probably get 1,000, 1,500 people who listen to this. And that is because, I mean, that's how the classics keep going. Even the most ridiculous abuses of these texts keep them vital. And I'm not sure if I finished that thought earlier, but there are real values to these texts, but what makes them essential and forces us to reckon with them is just the fact that everybody in European and U.S. intellectual circles has been reckoning with them and building these architectures, some solidly based, some completely ridiculously based, on these texts for 500 years.
But is it not also a lot of Asian countries use them as well? Because quite often, from what my understanding is, a lot of the Chinese sort of philosophers, the great ones seem to have like died away. So there was only very few. Confucius was seen as like a C tier at the time, but because he was one of the few that survived, it's now seen as this great oracle. So quite often when you hear about the Chinese, they'll do a bit of Confucius, but then they go into the ancient Greeks as well. Like I feel like it is just a worldwide culture at this point.
Wow, I'll confess I've not made much of a study of the uses of Greek philosophers. I think some of this is universal, and of course, unfortunately, if there wasn't already, I'm sure there already was. But whatever the departments at Chinese universities that study ancient Greek thought were absolutely given a push up by the fact that Harvard and Graham Allison were trotting out Thucydides again. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if, there's deeper study of this going on in China. I mean, we do have a unified world culture. A lot of the discussion of politics and international relations is deeply, deeply rooted in Western thought. The communists of the Chinese Communist Party is, at the end of the day, officially in pursuit of an ideology that was formulated by a German dude in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that German dude, Karl Marx, was intimately familiar with Thucydides and all the Greeks. Like that is they certainly, 19th century communists or socialists certainly billed themselves as, fresh and new and what have you, but they were completely shaped by ancient writings and classical theory.
Doesn't that also prove this trap wrong? Because I was sort of shocked. He's basically basing this trap on 18 empires?
Yes.
And 2 empires that were rising powers that didn't go to war was China and the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Because I sort of thought like you would do like, I don't know, you'd try to get hundreds and then break it down that way. But it's a bit like, oh, here's a bunch of Europeans and and they had a fight. It's so underbaked.
In pursuit of this Thucydides trap idea, Allison and the Belfer Center, they put together this laughable list. And I do have a video from 2014 that goes through that list, and it's just like, huh? Like there's this like, oh, Japan managed to rise during the 1980s without there being war with the United States. And I was just like, the United States garrisons Japan. Like it just no acknowledgement of differing historical eras, hegemony, what hegemony actually is just a profoundly silly intellectual endeavor, but a deeply successful one, and the reason why we're able to discuss Thucydides. I mean, just as so when the Thucydides trap in 2014 was not my first exposure to this. When I was in a Great Books program at the turn of the century, back in the 1990s, at my university in the Midwestern United States in Michigan, this is sadly not, my copy from back then is lost to the sands of time, but this was part of the curriculum long before the Thucydides trap, long before. It's just like part of the handbook for international relations education. And that's sort of weaponizing this book in service of the inevitable war with China is sort of the point of the Thucydides trap. And it's not the real Thucydides trap. It is not and just to lay it out one more time, like the real Thucydides trap is what the United States is doing right now, what Athens did across the 5th century BCE, which was take a winning coalition, the Athenians against the Persians, the United States against the Nazis and the Soviets, and turn those willing participants in your coalition into brutalized subjects. I would argue that the United States has been doing this long before Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is really letting the mask fall.
Well, yeah. He always reads the quiet part out loud.
Yes, and it's been really, over this past month, as I've been figuring out how do I respond to this just onslaught of stuff and which pieces do I respond to. I mean, I think we tried to do that last week with or a couple weeks back with the CFPB, just find one thing and focus on that for a morning and then talk about that. But I think if you're looking for like a broader explanation what is actually happening here, I think the real Thucydides trap is pretty good, and it's not going to stop with Donald Trump. Like I can't emphasize that enough. Whoever comes after Trump, whether it's J.D. Vance or some Democrat or some other Republican, without question, they're going to build themselves as, oh, we're the kindler, gentler hegemon. We're going to, please, oh, obviously, Trump was so uncouth. We would never say anything so negative or belligerent. But every single offensive deal that, Trump manages to win, every single concession will be held on to and expanded by the United States. I think there's a new German chancellor, Reichskanzler, or whatever they call it. I don't know, how long does it take to swear them in or whatever? Like, I'm not too.
But they're in the process.
Yeah, they're in the process. We know who it is. It's going to be a 2-party coalition instead of a 3-party coalition. This guy is Merz. Do you know what his first name is? Merz something.
Okay, Mersk. No.
It's something Merce. There have been clips of him that people have been really celebrating recently, saying, "Oh, we really need to be independent from the United States tomorrow," or I don't have the exact wording.
Well, I think Germany's arms manufacturers shares have shot up.
They have. They have. And I'm sure they did in 2022, and then just sort of actually, that's a good thing to look into maybe for a short. I'm sure they went up a ton in 2022, and they've just sort of drifted down ever since. And now they're back up again because this time Germany's serious. And I just don't, until Germany starts talking about getting the U.S. military out of all its German bases.
Friedrich Merz.
Yeah, Friedrich Merz or Merz, or is it the new chancellor? Definitely a name that we should know, and we will know soon, I promise.
Friedrich Merz.
Friedrich Merz, that's it, yes. But yeah, until Germany is kicking U.S. bases out of Germany, this is all just sort of happy talk. And I think that the last guy, was it Otto Scholz or what have you?
Yeah, Scholz.
Talked a really good game about the, what was it, this Zeitenwende? Was that the right? This new shift. We're gonna spend all this money on defense, and now the new chancellor's in 3 years later, and we're gonna spend all this money on defense, and we're gonna be more independent of the United States. And I don't believe it for a second. And there'll probably be a big press conference between this guy Maris and the next U.S. president about how we're all great friends again, and then we've put Donald Trump behind us, and the process will continue. It's I think there are people who would like to portray Donald Trump's ending of U.S. aid or all of the things he's said, and there's nothing he's actually done yet. But all of the things he's said about slowing down or cutting back U.S. military expenditure, somehow mean we've got some real reformulation here. And it's just, we're just getting rid of the nicer bits.
It seems like he's backtracked on it in the sense that it's like, oh, I'm going to cut, was it 8%, but then I'm going to reinvest that 8% back into the military. So it's a bit like, what's the point?
Oh, and the stuff that he's suggesting is exactly as ruinous and stupid.
But isn't it like veterans' rights and stuff like that? Isn't it like stuff that for like health benefits for veterans?
God, no. He's cutting the VA. He's cutting the VA mercilessly. And before he was cutting the VA mercilessly, he wanted to privatize it, which is, we've seen that with Medicare Advantage over the past 30 years, where you privatize it and basically the service gets worse.
Oh, yeah.
Private companies get more money. And that's what he wants to do, the VA. And I think additionally, he's cut the VA. No, what he's wanted. So there was this really exciting set of headlines a week or two back where, the Secretary of Defense orders the Pentagon to cut 8% across the board. I was like, marvelous. That's great. No, that's because they want to free up money to fund the American Iron Dome.
Yes.
Yeah, so essentially it's just written Ronald Reagan's Star Wars all over again. It is a missile defense shield for the entirety of the United States. Like Israel is like, I assume, is Israel smaller than Rhode Island? Like Israel
Well, it's also the fact that Israel will have it around Palestine, so it doesn't need to sort of theoretically be around all of Israel. It can just sort of surround Palestine as it is. But yes, it's significantly smaller, and it sort of has a very good idea of what sort of missiles will be coming, which are quite unsophisticated. Well, theoretically, we're back to the Russian subs that are invisible. Oh, China's got invisible missiles. We need to spend this much money on it. So, and also, yeah.
It's an excuse. So Donald Trump is trying to free up a little bit of money, so he has an excuse to spend infinite money on the Pentagon. It is not, I don't think it's escaped anybody's notice that Elon Musk is one of and SpaceX are sort of the world's greatest experts on satellite and rocket missile technology. So yeah, no, it is there's nothing. Trump will do a series of outrageous things. I think, certainly over the past couple months, there's been this pattern of he says all this insane stuff and then backs down to something that's not that horrible. But the insanity is the precedent.
Well, I think he wants to do the insane things. This just doesn't always work out.
And he will do many insane things. We saw that during the first Trump administration. I mean, what he did to Venezuela, what he did to Iran, what he did to the Iran nuclear deal. There's plenty of insanity to come. So there was this sort of 15 steps forward, 13 steps back approach to Ukraine. There was publicized the first draft of the minerals deal, which was basically like, I think they said it was worse than the Treaty of Versailles. That put reparations on Germany after World War I. And then, of course, the Trump administration had to back down. And, and a lot of people sort of smugly saying on the internet, come on, this is just to make Trump a little bit happy. And it's never actually going to come to anything. It's never actually going to mean anything. Well, I'm here to tell you that those friendly New Democrats or more polite J.D. Vance as president are going to enforce every most draconian aspect of that agreement to the letter on Ukraine after nasty Donald Trump is gone. And everyone will be expected to smile about it. This is the trajectory of U.S. empire at this point. I think that the United States, there's nothing inevitable about this. I think that the United States could absolutely choose to operate a better, more equitable, more peaceful empire. In the 1990s, that's what we were trying to do. That was our goal. And we successfully changed a lot of aspects of the way that the world functions in that direction. Since 9/11, however, it has been just all slumping towards Sicily would be a good way to put it. One of the other great set pieces of this book is the Sicilian expedition, which is the classic example of imperial overreach, when the Athenians that sort of controlled everything around Greece in that corner decided, well, what we really need to win this war is we're going to go take over Sicily. The comparisons between the Sicilian expedition and the Iraq War were flying about in the 2000s, long before the Thucydides trap. And we're accelerating towards that eventual idiotic thing that truly is the United States biting off more than it could chew. A great candidate would be war over Taiwan. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about just the way we have ground the Middle East into the dust over the past 40 years. I mean, I think that this is almost a two-parter. I think the greatest example of just sort of accelerating empire that asks more and more and gives less and less is what the United States has been doing in the Middle East over the past half century, pretty much. And it is, the Thucydides trap is a real thing, and it is not what Harvard wants you to believe it is. It's about the United States becoming the bad guy. And Donald Trump makes that obvious, but it's a much bigger story than just that.
Well, join us next time as we'll be talking about the sort of scary America ruining a continent.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.